तो मेरी शक्ल क्यों नहीं आई सबकी आगे से?
कहाँ कर दिया आपने?
जी
दंगल में हंस जा रही हूँ।
नहीं, मैंने हंस के कर
जी
तुम्हारी
मैंने हाँ गणेश जी लाइव हो गया है, आप प्लीज स्टार्ट करिए।
और अब बाकी सबके गायब हो गए।
नमस्कार। आज के कार्यक्रम में आप सभी का स्वागत है। जैसा कि आप सब जानते हैं कि आज हम लोग एक पुस्तक चर्चा पर चर्चा के लिए उपस्थित हुए हैं। पुस्तक का नाम है कैपिटलिज्म, कॉलोनियलिज्म एंड ग्लोबलाइजेशन स्टडीज इन इकोनॉमिक चेंज। इस पुस्तक को संपादित किया है प्रोफेसर शिरीन मूसवी जी ने, जो फेमस इतिहासकार हैं, हम लोग जानते हैं। और अलीगढ़ मुस्लिम विश्वविद्यालय में मैंने अध्यापन किया है। तो आज इस पुस्तक की परिचर्चा के लिए हम लोग उपस्थित हुए हैं, जिसमें मुख्य अतिथि के रूप में देश दुनिया के जाने माने इतिहासकार प्रोफेसर इरफान हबीब हमारे बीच हैं। ये सुखद संयोग है कि सर हमारे बीच हैं, आज हम उनको सुनेंगे। और अध्यक्षता प्रोफेसर शिरीन मुसवी जी कर रही हैं, जिनके बारे में मैंने अभी बताया। और पैनलिस्ट के रूप में हमारे 3 विद्वान हैं आज, जिसमें प्रोफेसर प्रभात पटनायक, जो अर्थशास्त्री हैं और आपने जेएनयू में अध्यापन कार्य किया है सर, बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। और दूसरे प्रोफेसर आदित्य मुखर्जी जी, जो इतिहासकार हैं और जेएनयू में प्रोफेसर रहे हैं। और तीसरे पैनलिस्ट हैं हमारे प्रोफेसर उत्सा पटनायक, जो अर्थशास्त्री हैं और जेएनयू में प्रोफेसर रहे हैं। आप सभी का आज के कार्यक्रम में बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। मैं औपचारिक स्वागत वक्तव्य के लिए विकास जी को आमंत्रित करूंगा कि आप सभी अतिथियों का स्वागत करें। विकास जी।
Okay, thank you so much, Ganesh ji, for giving me this opportunity. I will not take more time. First of all, I would like to congratulate and thanks to Professor Shireen Moosvi ma'am for giving this book discussion opportunity to the India Research Scholars Association. And as a president of this association, it is a privilege and great honor for me to deliver the welcome address such a esteemed panelist. I would like to welcome to Professor Irfan Habib sir, eminent historian, and हम लोग उनको सभी जानते हैं. And thank you sir for accepting my request. I would like to welcome to Professor Prabhat Patnaik sir, famous economist and former professor, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, JNU. I would like to welcome to Professor Utsa Patnaik ma'am, and thanks ma'am for accepting my request. And so ma'am is a famous economist, and ma'am is also former professor in the Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU. I would like to welcome to Professor Aditya Mukherjee sir. I think sir will join later due to some health reason. So all the scholars and participants, those have joined the various parts of the India. So I would like to welcome on behalf of the India Research Scholars Association and on behalf of me to all members of the IRSA and panelist guests and participants. I will not take more time. So thank you so much, and over to you, Ganesh Lalji. Thank you.
शुक्रिया विकास जी। आज पहले वक्ता के रूप में मैं सबसे पहले प्रोफेसर इरफान हबीब सर को आमंत्रित करता हूं। जैसा कि हम सब जानते हैं कि प्रोफेसर इरफान हबीब देश और दुनिया के जाने माने इतिहासकार हैं, जिन्होंने इकोनॉमिक दृष्टि से, अर्थशास्त्र की दृष्टि से इतिहास का विशद लेखन किया है और हम सब उनको पढ़ते हैं, एकेडमिक्स में भी और बहुत तरह की चीजों में जानते समझते हैं। तो मैं सर को बड़े आदर के साथ आमंत्रित करता हूँ कि सर अपना वक्तव्य हम लोगों के बीच रखें और हमें लाभान्वित करें। स्वागत है सर।
हाँ, ये बताइए कितना वक्त स्पीकर्स को दे रहे हैं आप इंडिविजुअल?
नो सर, ना आपके लिए सर कोई टाइम का लिमिट
नहीं
हमने
नहीं
नहीं दी
नहीं,
है।
आप बोल रहे सर।
इसके
जी
माने
सर।
बहुत कम वक्त दे रहे हैं हम।
नहीं 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 सर, कम वक्त नहीं है सर। आप जी सर, जी सर।
Yes. Mr. President and fellow members on the panel and other friends listening in, I'm very happy to have this occasion in which one could set perhaps developments in individual countries like India in an international pattern. We must remember that for the last 200 years preceding our independence in 1947, we were largely a colony of Great Britain. And of course, the economy of India was a part of world economy centuries earlier when trade routes were established and we were joined with China on the one hand and Europe on the other, as early as um, 4th century BC. So, international economy is an old story, but last what happened in the last 200 or 250 years was that it came to be dominated by what are broadly called Atlantic nations or North Atlantic nations, Western Europe, and subsequently United States, and that is Northern America. Uh, that kind of dominance has been unique in world history. And therefore, whether for a country situated in the subordinate zone, the colonial zone like India, if you leave out China as a semi-colony, then India was the largest colony. Remembering that before 1947, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India were one country. We were the largest colony. And how we were exploited economically and not only politically but economically also by Britain is not only an Indian story but an international story. When studying Indian history, we often forget these links. For example, it was the plunder of gold and silver in the Americas, first by simply robbing the people there and then making them work in mines in inhuman conditions in which hundreds of thousands died, perhaps millions, and they flooded the world with gold and silver so that an exploitation of Americas became a vehicle, became an instrument for the exploitation of the rest of the world beyond Western Europe. So that India was happy to receive gold and silver as England and France and other West Europe, Spain and Portugal earlier traded with India. But actually, we should realize that in effect, we were being exploited by the use of gold and silver plundered from America. And ultimately, that kind of transfer of wealth led to the colonial possession of India. Now, what I would like particularly to emphasize is that this entire phenomenon is overlooked in our syllabi. Um, I'm not only talking of the present syllabus that the model syllabus that the BJP regime has prescribed. Um, that, of course, has hardly anything on the international roots of colonialism. But even earlier syllabi did not include, even in their syllabus, in their rules for first world history, did not actually um, specify colonialism in all its aspects. Of course, we study colonialism as far as the exploitation of India was concerned, but we hardly learned that that exploitation was linked very much with the discovery of America also, was linked with slave trade and the income received from slave trade, which was silver and gold, in silver and gold extracted from the Americas, and then by this Western European nations, colonial nations, bought Indian commodities as early as the 16th and 17th centuries, when colonialism was not established here. So I would like to urge that when we are studying Indian history, not only economic history of India, but also political history, we should bear the entire change in the world that took place in the 16th century. The rise of colonialism took place long before the British conquest of India or before the Battle of Plassey of 1757. A world perspective is therefore necessary. Now I realize that making this demand is like crying in the dark, because our syllabi today, as prescribed by the University Grants Commission, are completely modeled on some other ideology. But whether we are talking of school syllabi or university syllabi, I think this change in the world order and the links that were established between the colonial occupation of India and the plunder of the Americas, slave trade, and so on, the wealth gathered from there, that kind of study is very important. And that's very important for understanding what happened in India. And that is also very important for understanding how colonialism took place and how our fates are also bound with the fates of African slaves carried across the Atlantic to the Americas. So I hope that in the discussions that take place, this wider aspect of Indian history, not only modern Indian history where I have discussed colonial links, but even if you come to ancient India, unless you bear the achievements of Greek philosophy and Greek civilization in mind, it is very difficult to place developments in Indian scientific knowledge that took place in ancient India, because the connection with Greek uh, achievements is obvious. And this was noticed particularly early by Al-Biruni in the 11th century, as early as that. The man was familiar with Greek science as well as with Sanskrit. So I would urge that when you study Indian history, we must always bear in mind what was happening around us. And not only for purposes of relationships, but also for comparison. For instance, Chinese pilgrims were amazed that Indians don't have the concept of their own country, India, as unlike Chinese, who had a much better popular grasp of their own country. So all these interesting aspects come to our mind as we study what foreigners wrote about us and what was happening in foreign countries. If we confine our study only to Indian history, we are not, we will probably miss many important aspects in which, particularly in the ways that ideas and knowledge traveled. Thank you.
बहुत शुक्रिया सर, थैंक यू, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। आपने माइक को
वही बंद करो।
आई थिंक प्रभात प्रभात सर के तरफ थोड़ा सा
हाँ सर,
प्रॉब्लम।
माइक
जी
बंद कर लिए।
जी
हाँ,
जी जी,
थैंक यू
यस
सर।
यस प्लीज।
आपने अर्थशास्त्रीय दृष्टिकोण को और पॉलिटिकली दृष्टिकोण को आपने उपनिवेशवाद से जोड़ा कि किस तरह से आधुनिक भारत में ही नहीं बल्कि प्राचीन भारत में भी ग्रीक नॉलेज सिस्टम का प्रभाव देखने को मिलता है। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया सर। अब कार्यक्रम के अगली कड़ी में मैं प्रोफेसर शिरीन मूसवी मैम को आमंत्रित करता हूँ।
लास्ट में प्रोफेसर प्रभात पटनायक से।
अच्छा, शुक्रिया। पैनलिस्ट के रूप में मैं प्रोफेसर प्रभात पटनायक सर को आमंत्रित करता हूं। सर, आप जाने माने समाज अर्थशास्त्री हैं और जेएनयू के प्रोफेसर रहे हैं। सर, आपका स्वागत है।
How much time do I have?
20 to 25 minutes, sir.
20
Well,
से
let's say 20 minutes. All right.
Yeah,
Well, first of all,
25 minutes, sir. Yes, yes, sir.
thank you very much for having me on this panel. In fact, I want to congratulate you for having this panel, having discussion on this extremely important book which Professor Shireen Moosvi edited. These days, you don't have book discussions on academic books as much as you have on contemporary on books of contemporary relevance. So the fact that you are having this discussion on an academic book, on a weighty academic book, is a matter of gratification, and I'd like to congratulate you. Well, I would like to begin with what Professor Habib says in his introductory piece in this book, that basically there was a time that all of us thought of capitalism as basically a transitional mode of production. We thought that, okay, after some time, the world is going to become socialist. Now you have an impression which is exactly contrary to this. In fact, many people are now talking about capitalism being a mode of production that has really come to last. So much so that even people on the left think of capitalism as too big to be overthrown. And this is particularly true after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I want to address myself to this particular question because I have a very different opinion on this, on which I have written in this book, but I'd like to elaborate that a little bit. Rosa Luxemburg had said in, around the time of the First World War, that really the choice before mankind was between capitalism and barbarism. That basically, sorry, between socialism and barbarism. That basically either the world goes socialist or the world would sink into, incredible barbarism. I believe that is a proposition which many people would have doubted in the immediate post Second World War years. But that's a proposition which is even more true today than it was at the time that Rosa Luxemburg talked about. And I'll try and explain why I believe that. Basically, when we talk in terms of today's capitalism, it is neoliberal capitalism that we are talking about. Now, neoliberal capitalism has a very important features. The first is the following. For much of the history of capitalism, labor from the global south was not allowed freely to move to the global north, and it still is not. As you know, there are these tragic stories of people trying to enter Europe and dying on the way. So obviously, labor from the global south, whether earlier or now, is not allowed free entry to the global north. Capital from the global north was allowed free entry to the global south throughout the history of capitalism. But on the other hand, apart from certain specific activities which basically buttressed the colonial pattern of division of labor, international division of labor, namely producing raw materials, managing agencies, and railways for extracting mineral products, and so on. Other than these areas, capital from the north did not really come to the global south. Even though the wages in the global south were lower, and if capital had come to produce the same manufactured goods using the same techniques in the global south at lower wages, it would have actually made much greater profits. But nonetheless, the mobility of capital, despite being juridically allowed, was extremely limited. As a matter of fact, around the time of the First World War, only 10% of Britain's total foreign direct investment was located in India, which was its largest colony. Much of it actually went to the temperate regions of the world where European labor also migrated. So the world, if and as far as entrepreneurs of the global south are concerned, whenever they produced something, they had to meet first, of course, local discrimination, and second, within a colonial framework, and secondly, they also had to meet high tariffs in the global north, because of which basically the world got segmented into a developed and an underdeveloped segments. Now, one very important feature of it is that as labor productivity increased in the developed part of the world, wages also increased along with it. Therefore, you actually had a larger and growing gap in wages between the global north and the global south. And so much so, some people have argued that in the global north, let us say between 1870 and 1939, the share of wages uh, uh, in national income remained constant. Other people have doubted this, but wages rose considerably. In fact, capitalism's social stability was assured by the fact that wages rose in the global north along with labor productivity. I believe this segmentation of the world has now come to an end. Even though labor is still not allowed to migrate freely from the south to the north, capital is now not only juridically allowed, but actually is locating in some parts of the global south plants to produce the same goods which it was otherwise producing in the global north, but locating it in the south and getting much higher rates of profit because of the lower wages. Not saying that it is going to all countries in the global south, but certain countries, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's Vietnam, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it's Indonesia, many countries of the global south now locate plants which are set up by capital from the global north. Now, this has a number of implications. The first implication is that now the labor of the global north can no longer be segmented or isolated from the labor of the global south, because of which the wages in the global north tend to get linked to the reserve army of labor that exists in the global south because of the processes of deindustrialization and so on that had happened in the colonial period. Because of which you find that unlike earlier when wages were rising along with labor productivity increases, in the period of neoliberalism, in the period of neoliberal globalization, wages in the global north are not rising. As a matter of fact, Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, made a calculation in which he compared the real wage of an average male American worker in 1968 with the real wage in 2011 and found that in 2011, the absolute real wage of this male American average worker was marginally lower than 1968. Not that it was falling, but it had increased, but then there has been a fall, which is symptomatic of the period of neoliberal globalization. Now, from this, the impression that sometimes is got is that okay, in the north the wages are suffering, but in the south the wages must be rising. This, however, is not true. This is not true for a number of reasons. Firstly, the labor reserves in the global south do not get exhausted despite capital moving from the north to the south because globalization has a number of other features. The first feature is that it entails a withdrawal of state support from petty production, small scale production. As you know, in India, for instance, before neoliberal policies became current, you actually had, for instance, certain kinds of textiles products being reserved for the handloom sector. You had government protection for a lot of petty production sector, including, of course, for agriculture. But neoliberalism essentially means that you have the nation state confronting international capital. Capital gets globalized, internationalized, but the state remains a nation state. So the nation state has to do basically what international you'd be in a crisis. Because of this, the nation state does things which capital wants it to do, and capital wants it not to extend this kind of support. Now, neoliberalism essentially means that
ये बंद कैसे हो गया?
इरफान सर, प्रभात सर की तरफ थोड़ा सा नेटवर्क
शायद
इशू है, तो
नेटवर्क इशू
जी
है।
जी वो
okay, is that all right?
yes, now
हाँ
okay,
हाँ
sir.
Okay,
सर।
fine. So you find that therefore the petty production sector gets into a crisis in the absence of state support in the period of neoliberalism in all countries of the global south. And that basically is one reason why unemployment swells. The second reason is that there is a rapidity in the introduction of technological progress, which is essentially labor saving because of the fact that now countries compete against one another. If you have a relatively freer trade, then Indian producers have to compete against, let's say, Chinese producers, they have to compete against producers from other countries. And if in those other countries you find that they are in a better position to sell at a lower cost, then of course you get outcompeted. Therefore, the competition between the different countries increases the rate of growth of labor productivity. And as you know, if the rate of growth of labor productivity is high, correspondingly, the rate of growth of employment is low. And in India, as a matter of fact, the rate of growth of employment during the neoliberal period has been lower than the rate of growth of the workforce, population, and of the workforce. Uh, because of these reasons, the size of the what Marx would have called the reserve army of labor relative to the total workforce increases despite the fact that mobility of capital to the global south is occurring. And this, of course, naturally implies that real wages don't rise. A couple of other factors that real wages don't rise is first an enormous weakening of trade unions. This occurs for two reasons. Firstly, it occurs because now even the working class is organized on national lines. You have Indian workers, you have Pakistani workers, you have workers in Indonesia, but capital is international. And as a result, if workers go on a strike, then capital may decide to relocate its plants elsewhere, because of which the militancy of the workers is something which gets constrained. Besides, the neoliberal period, of course, also sees privatization of public sector enterprises. Now, everywhere in the world, the public sector workers are much better organized, much more unionized than the private sector workers. In America, for instance, one third, about 33% of the total public sector employees, which here I'm including the education sector as well, is unionized. But in the private sector, the percentage of unionized total workforce is just about 7%. So, any privatization of the public sector necessarily implies a setback as far as the trade union movement is concerned, as far as the workers' bargaining is concerned. For all these reasons, you actually find that even while the wages in the global north don't rise, in fact, fall to some extent, the wages in the global south do not rise, despite the fact that capital is to some extent moving from the north to the south. Now, therefore, if you look at the vector of global wages, then that vector of global wages does not rise. But on the other hand, the vector of labor productivities across the world is rising, because of which the share of the economic surplus in total world output increases, including in particular countries. Now, this has two implications. One has drawn much attention. That is what all these people like Piketty have been talking about, namely the rise in inequality. As you know, Piketty's figures suggest that the top 1% of the Indian population had about 12% of India's total national income at the time of independence. It came down to about 6% in 1982, but since then it has increased and it's now about 22.6%, which is higher than at any period over the last 100 years. Therefore, there is an enormous increase in income inequality and associated with it in the wealth inequality. But the second feature, which is less discussed, is the fact that a rise in the share of surplus, that is, a shift of income distribution from working people's income to economic surplus, creates a tendency towards overproduction crisis. That's because out of a unit of economic surplus, less tends to be consumed than out of a unit of working people's incomes. A peasant, if he is given a rupee, would in fact more or less consume the rupee. If a worker is given a rupee, would more or less consume most of the rupee. But on the other hand, if you give a rupee to, let's say, a top-notch lawyer, or if you give a rupee to the capitalist, then they would consume a part of it, but put the rest in their pockets for future use. Therefore, any such redistribution from the working people to economic surplus tends to reduce the level of consumption and output. And once the consumption gets reduced, therefore, you find that investment also tends to get cut back, and therefore, there is a crisis of overproduction. This crisis can be delayed for a while, as indeed it was in the late 90s and early this century, because you have the promotion of all kinds of bubbles, namely artificial inflation of wealth for speculative reasons. And that tended to stimulate some consumption and some demand. But with the collapse of the housing bubble in the United States, no such comparable bubble has taken place, and therefore you actually have a crisis of overproduction, which is now afflicting the world economy. Now, the important point is that this crisis of overproduction, which manifests itself above all in the form of higher unemployment across the world, is something which cannot be overcome under neoliberal capitalism. The reason is the following. We know that John Maynard Keynes, for instance, in the 1930s had suggested that, look, it's very easy. If you have a problem of insufficient demand, the state can come and boost demand through its own expenditures. But for state expenditure to boost demand, it is necessary that either the state resorts to a fiscal deficit, namely it spends 100 rupees but doesn't tax anybody 100 rupees, doesn't tax anybody anything. Therefore, there is a net increase in demand. Or alternatively, it spends 100 rupees but taxes only the rich people, because the rich people, if they give 100 rupees in the form of taxation, only a part of it comes out of their consumption and the other part comes out of their consumption would go up. Therefore, the result is that the state spends nothing and taxes the majority of the people. The state spends nothing and taxes the minority, and therefore the result is that the state gets nothing. So the only way the state can boost demand is either by taxing the rich or by imposing or brought about by internationalizing capital. And every country in the world has therefore developed the fiscal deficit setup as we have engaged in. And all over the world is about 3% of GDP. In European countries, it is staggering 15% of GDP. Budgets for schools are massive. Right? And of course, the state cannot engage in fiscal deficit. The state cannot also tax the rich, because it would like to do so would capriciously invite some other country. Therefore, the budgets of the periphery are competing with one another to give tax concessions to the countries in order to entice them to come to their shores to undertake development. So, because this is the way state fiscal deficit can be governed. And I would also request that you kindly add into of massive
आशुतोष,
demand
ये इंटरनेट कहाँ नहीं कनेक्ट हो रहा है? नहीं तो ये जियो वाला कहीं नहीं कनेक्ट हो रहा है साला हमारा। नहीं जियो वाला। नहीं तो हाँ हो गया।
they actually use the easy availability of credit to boost their profit margins and give rise to inflation, which is what has happened. Therefore, neoliberalism has brought capitalism to a crisis from which there is no escape within neoliberalism itself. It has run into a dead end. Now, the phenomenon which in this period of neoliberalism's dead end comes to the fore is neo-fascism. When neoliberalism reaches a crisis or reaches this kind of a dead end with mass unemployment, then immediately it resorts to neo-fascism, which is exactly what had happened in the 1930s depression, and this is exactly what is happening now all over the world. Whether you look at Argentina, Milei, whether you look at Trump, United States, whether you look at Italy, Meloni, whether you look at Paris, France, Marine Le Pen, whether you look at Hungary, Orban, whether you look at Turkey, Erdogan, whether you look at India, Modi, everywhere there is an enormous sweep of neo-fascism. And you can ask yourself, why is it that suddenly all over the world these neo-fascists are coming up? Fundamentally, to my mind, they're coming up because they are an expression of the dead end to which neoliberalism has actually brought the world. And the crisis is not soluble, resolvable under neoliberalism, under the neoliberal order, and therefore we are now stuck with this neo-fascism. Unless you can go beyond neoliberalism and thereby overcome the crisis, this neo-fascism would remain a permanent feature of our society. Look at Trump. He got defeated, but on the other hand, he's back in power. Even if tomorrow the Modi government, the BJP government gets defeated, and if we remain within the confines of neoliberalism, they'll make a comeback. So the important point at the moment is actually to go beyond neoliberal capitalism. Going beyond neoliberal capitalism, which is the latest phase of capitalism, amounts to, in my mind, going beyond capitalism itself. Of course, not as a one shot, but necessarily through stages. In other words, unless we transcend capitalism in by having an agenda around which people can be mobilized, an agenda that initially helps us to overcome the crisis of neoliberalism, but then in the process, as opposition to it is mounted by the capitalist order, we'll have to increasingly fight against that order and therefore overcome it. Now, unless we do that, we are stuck with neo fascism. Therefore, as Rosa Luxemburg had said, the choice before mankind at the time she was writing was between barbarism and socialism. I believe the choice in I'm not saying in an immediate sense, but the fundamental choice of the current conjuncture of the world economy is between neo-fascism and an advance towards socialism. Therefore, all those who argue that capitalism has now triumphed and capitalism is now become permanent feature, it's a mode of production that's going to last, are really completely mistaken, and they're barking up the wrong tree. As a matter of fact, in country after country, you find evidence of this. Thank you very much.
थैंक यू सर, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। आपने ग्लोबलाइजेशन के विविध आर्थिक संदर्भों को हमारे सामने रखा, उनका बहुत बारीकी से विश्लेषण किया। बहुत महत्वपूर्ण वक्तव्य हम लिए है, बहुत आभार इसके लिए। कार्यक्रम की अगली कड़ी में मैं अगले पैनलिस्ट के रूप में प्रोफेसर उत्सा पटनायक जी को आमंत्रित करता हूं। आप जेएनयू में प्रोफेसर रही हैं और अर्थशास्त्री हैं। मैम, आपका स्वागत है। उत्सा पटनायक जी।
Thank you very much, Professor Irfan Habib, sir, Professor Shireen Moosvi, and all participants in this discussion. I was looking through the volume edited by Professor Shireen Moosvi, which came out some in 2011, that is 13 years ago. And looking at it after some years, I must confess, and I'm impressed by the fact that the contributions ranged over the colonial period and also encompassed the modern period of neo-colonial resurgence under neoliberal opening up of the ex-colonized countries once more to free trade and once more to policies of fiscal contraction. So the range of articles here is quite wide, impressively so. But in the limited time that I have, I would like to focus on the history part, and in particular, since mostly research students are involved in this discussion, I would like to sound some words of warning when you engage in research, particularly in economic history, in the area of economic history. We are all strongly influenced by ideas and theories from northern universities. Now, while there are many fine scholars there, and they have written very interesting books on the transition of the first industrial country, Britain, on the industrial revolution there and its diffusion over the world, they themselves are influenced sometimes without even realizing it by an imperialist discourse, an intellectual discourse which contains very many fallacies, material fallacies, that is, incorrect statement of facts, as well as logical fallacies in the theories that they take for granted. Now, I would like to illustrate what I'm saying, and particularly the areas where the research student has to be careful, by taking up three interrelated questions. The first is that there is a pervasive ignoring, in my view, of the mercantilist discrimination that the colonies of conquest faced from today's advanced capitalist countries in their phase of transition. And of course, the prime example of that is the discrimination that India faced in the hands of England. Now, everyone knows that, and Hobsbawm, in his famous phrase, as he put it, whoever says industrial revolution says cotton. That is, the cotton textile industry was really the basis for the transition to a factory system in Britain, to its going from a stage of merchant capitalism, which we found all over the world, in Europe, in Asia, and so on, to a specifically industrial capitalism. Now, if you read the historians of the Industrial Revolution, whether they are English themselves, such as Dean and Cole's classic work, or if you read Eric Hobsbawm was not English, but he taught eventually in an English university, or you read David Land's The Unbound Prometheus on technological change in the textile industry in Britain, which laid the groundwork for the industrial transition. Or even if you read a Marxist, an eminent Marxist like Christopher Hill, from Reformation to Industrial Revolution. To a critical reader, there is one thing which will stick out, which will absolutely be evident, that all of them ignore the question of Indian textiles. Without this long period of protectionism, and it lasted for more than 100 years, it is very doubtful if the Industrial Revolution could ever have taken place. And yet, not a single one of these historians make any reference to the mercantilist policies that England follows. Now, what were these mercantilist policies? What are mercantilist policies? Basically, these are the policies in which a country closes its markets to what it perceives to be actual or potential competitors in the production of certain goods, particularly manufactured goods, in the case of Britain, whereas it insists on keeping the markets of the colonized countries completely open to dumping of its own manufactures. So it is a sort of one-way free trade in which the country which is industrializing actually closes its markets to competitive goods. And in the case of England in the 18th century, the major competitive good was from India. The British East India Company had been importing Indian textiles ever since it started its operations from 1600 onwards, long before formal colonization. And of course, we should really date formal colonization by the company in India to 1765. Now, Plassey in 1757 was a curtain raiser, but the real phase of colonial control starts when the company gets the right of revenue collection in Bengal from 1765 from the Mughal emperor, because that is the right of exercising sovereignty. Before that, it was just a trading company. It exploited the local producers, but it could not exploit them in the way that it could after it got the right of revenue collection. Because once it got that right in 1765, that is, once it acquired the Diwani of Bengal, then of course it did not need to pay the local producers at all for the goods it got from them for importing into England, because it simply used the locally raised taxation and other revenues to so-called purchase those goods from the very same people who were taxed. The goods were taken because they were the producers of those goods, free. So long before this, however, what it had started from 1700 is to close its market to the consumption by the English population of Indian textiles. And Paul Mantoux, in his Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, gives us a very clear and vivid account of this protectionist policy, where there was an absolute ban which was imposed by Britain on the consumption by the British population. Well, Britain as such probably did not exist. Most people refer to to refer to English at this time, because we were talking
जो
about
है वो
English
हेमंत भी
Parliament,
नहीं है
there
और
was
वो
an absolute ban
भी फोन किया और
on
उसको
the
क्या बोलते हैं
consumption of imported
शुभांगी का भी
Persian
गला
and
खराब है
Indian textiles by
तो
the
एक
English
आदमी सब
population.
चीज करेंगे तो
And
अच्छा
this
ही रहेगा
ban
ना
was
पैनलिस्ट
enforced
क्योंकि वर्ल्ड लेवल पे लोग
later on in 1721. The
लास्ट
ban
में
was
डी के बाद श्रीन मौसी में
strengthened
5 मिनट
by
बोलेंगे और इसके
imposing
बाद
very heavy fines on anyone, any individual
वो नहीं है वहाँ
who was
आज
found wearing imported cotton.
वही बोल रही
Uh,
हैं
of course, importation,
वो
use of
सर
imported
नहीं है
cotton
मैं
from
सर जैसे
India
लगे
was
रहेंगे
banned, but smuggling still continued, some amount of smuggling. So if an individual was found wearing it, then that individual would be
थोड़ा
fined
सा ठीक है थोड़ा सा
£5.
बोल देना अपनी लिखी
Now, the
होती है
per capita income in England at that time was £7
ठीक है
annually.
लिख लेना थोड़ा
So
सा ठीक से
£5 was a
बोलेंगे
very
तो
heavy fine. And
एक
if a merchant was
एक
found to
दो
be evading the ban and selling banned goods, which was a multiple of the per capita income. Now, it took England 74 long years, 3/4 of a century, to develop the machinery because their artisans could not compete with the artisans of Bengal, of present day Andhra coast, or of Madras presidency in the fineness of the yarn and the cloth that they produced. They had their own artisans, but they lacked the skill to produce these cotton goods. So it took England 75 years of this protectionism, of a complete ban, to develop the machinery which would allow yarn which was fine enough and strong enough to compete with the banned imported yarn and cloth. 75 years of outright ban. But the protectionism did not end. When Arkwright petitioned Parliament saying that now we could ourselves produce machine-made yarn and cloth, and the English population should not be banned from consuming locally produced cotton cloth. Parliament recognized the validity of this argument and it lifted the ban on consumption. But at the same time, it imposed very high tariffs on the imported Indian goods. So protection continued in a different form. And in fact, the level of tariffs was raised manifold as late between 1774 and 1813, from let us say 15 to 20%, the tariff rate was raised to 74%, 84% on certain categories of Indian textiles. And all tariffs did not finally grow until 1846. So you have nearly 150 years of protectionism of the English market against Indian textiles. But is there a single mention of it? No, there is not a single mention of it by Dean and Cole, not a single mention of protectionism by Hobsbawm, even when he is discussing the textile industry and its rise and its how it laid the groundwork for factory production in Britain. There is not a single mention of it in David Land's The Unbound Prometheus when he's discussing technological change in cotton textiles in India, in England, and not even Christopher Hill, an eminent Marxist historian who is explicitly discussing mercantilist policies in his book, Reformation to Industrial Revolution. He discusses the mercantile protectionist policies that England followed vis-a-vis Ireland. He discusses the policies that England followed vis-a-vis the North American colonies, but he has not a single word to say about English protectionism against Indian textiles. Why? Ask yourself that question. Does it not reflect a very, very strong bias, whether conscious or unconscious, in the writings of these very eminent economic historians, whose books are read by textbooks to English students and whose books are very influential amongst our students as well? Now, against this, if you read Paul Martou, who gives you an account of this protectionist history, and later on, not later on, even earlier, Friedrich List, who very clearly said that, look, it is only because of protectionism that the mills of Manchester could function at all. Because if England had not protected itself, and England by doing so was actually violating its own theory that free trade was good for everybody, everyone should follow free trade, They did actually the opposite. They did not follow free trade. They protected their own market. So their conception of free trade was free trade for us. We should have the freedom to dump our manufactures wherever we like, to dump our manufacturers on colonies of conquest without any hindrance, without any protection from being allowed from them. They should be completely trade liberalized. There should be free trade as far as colonized markets are concerned. But we have the right to protect our own market. So that is why somebody coined the phrase one way free trade. That is, the classical economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, etc., were very clear that when they talked about free trade, they did not mean free trade, the freedom of Indians or the colonized Caribbeans to export their own manufactures to metropolitan markets. They only meant the freedom of metropolitan countries to export their manufactures to compulsorily open colonized markets. Okay? So this is a very important area, I think, which we need to think about and we need to critique again and again, that the history that we are taught is, in fact, very distorted. And it is not only the Cambridge Economic History of India, it is Indian economic historians themselves, because they are so strongly influenced by metropolitan theories who mislead our students. Again, whether consciously or unconsciously, one does not know, and it's difficult to tell. And what our students get is a very distorted picture of what the Industrial Revolution, how it actually occurred. The first Industrial Revolution occurred. And of course, in North America, you have the same thing. You have the very conservative economic historians denying that North America ever protected its markets in order to develop its own manufactures. In fact, protectionism also was very important for the development of the North American industrial sector once the North American colonized population gained independence in the late 18th century. Now, related to this, I want to, again, this is related to the question of trade. I want to point out that there is a theory, and this is the dominant theory, as it were, in Western discussion of the economic relations between today's advanced countries and today's
आशुतोष तुम क्वेश्चन
developing countries,
पूछोगे
the past economic relations. The dominant theory is that
पूछना हो
it
तो
was a
बताओ
purely internal dynamic which propelled
पूछना
the
हो तो
West
बताओ
European countries and later got
एक क्वेश्चन
generalized
पूछ
to
लेना
North
तुम
America, which led to their industrial advance, which led to what later came to be called the Great Divergence, where starting from a very similar position at the beginning of the 18th century, one group of countries in Western Europe and North America surged ahead in terms of GDP growth, in terms of industrial development, in terms of per capita income, in terms of modernization. And another group of countries, the colonized countries, fell behind. So this is what was described by Keith Pomeranz as the Great Divergence. And this is what the debate is all about, what explains the origins of the Great Divergence. Now, there's the dominant, as it were, theory in Northern academia is that it was a purely internal dynamic which propelled the West European countries, that there was something unique about European feudalism which gave rise to capitalism. There's nothing unique about European feudalism at all. Europe and Asia were at the same level. In fact, Asia was probably economically considerably more advanced than Europe, until we come to the period of the violent external expansionism of a handful of West European powers and the violent subjugation of peoples primarily in tropical lands. So when we talk about colonies of conquest, you will see that there is only one colony of conquest which is located in the cold temperate region, that is Ireland, which was the first colony of Britain and probably we can say remained its last colony before getting independence. But all other countries are colonies of conquest of the European powers, were located in the tropical areas. And this is not accidental. It is because if you look at the whole question objectively, which the economic historians of the North have not done so far, you see that in fact, Europe, and to this day, Europe as well as North America, are extremely poorly endowed in terms of their primary sector resources. They actually had very little resources. And you know, the primary sector, that is the land, land is the basis of everything. It gives you your food, fibers for clothing, minerals. It gives you your raw materials for manufacturers. It gives you timber for building. So the primary sector is not called the primary sector for nothing. It is absolutely basic to any country's economic development. Now, because of its cold climate, cold temperate Europe, and even the Mediterranean countries, what we call Latin Europe, could produce, and this is true to this day, only one crop in the entire year. And this is true also of Canada and the US. They produce only one crop, not more than one crop. And we take for granted the fact that we can produce two crops a year, and in areas which are favorably located, up to three crops can be produced from the same plot of land, which is unthinkable in Europe or in North America. So in fact, agricultural productivity, correctly defined, was always very much higher in tropical lands. And number two, there is a huge range of products which tropical lands can produce, which the northern lands could not produce then and cannot produce to this day. That is, the output of tropical crops in those lands was zero in the past, it is zero today, it will remain zero tomorrow. But not only the tropical crops, even the crops they can produce in their summer months, they cannot produce in their winter months. So they are import dependent on warmer lands like ours, to completely import dependent. That is why foreign trade and control over the superior productive capacity of tropical lands has been so important in European history. Now, when these historians from northern universities, well-known ones, when they estimate their own trade, they use a wrong concept of trade, which is not used either by any international organization like United Nations, World Bank, which regularly give you country-wise trade data. They use a concept of trade which none of these organizations employ, nor is their concept of trade to be found in any modern textbook of open economy macroeconomics. So it is their own unique concept of trade, which was pioneered by Dean and Cole. And in this concept, they define a country's trade as the sum of the imports that it uses within that country, plus its domestic exports of its own goods. And re-exports are left out completely. Okay, now this is a wrong definition of trade. A country's trade consists of total imports, that is not only the imports it uses within its own country, but also the imported goods it may re-export to other countries. So you have to take total imports. Similarly, you have to take total exports. That is not only the exports of the goods you produce, but the exports of the goods you have imported and then you are re-exporting. So what these economic historians like Dean and Cole, and following them, all more modern economic historians like Crafts, like Harley and McCloskey, who are located in North American universities do, is that they all use this wrong concept of trade, which is not found in any macroeconomics textbooks, which is not used by any international organization, because they all leave out re-exports. Now, this is very significant because the colonizing powers like England, Netherlands, France, they all had a very large re-export trade. Why? Because they had political control over tropical lands, their tropical colonies. They could use the local taxes to purchase huge amounts of commodities that they could not produce themselves in such huge volumes that they were incapable of absorbing all of them within their own country. But these commodities were valuable for re-export. Through these re-exports of these free commodities, they could then import goods from other temperate land countries. For example, Britain re-exported something like 11 to 12% of its GDP worth of goods that it got free from its tropical colonies like India, the Caribbean islands, and so on. It re-exported against import of food grains in which it was deficient, import of iron from Sweden, timber for the shipping industry. So by leaving out the re-exports completely, these historians have one after the other produced incorrect estimates of global trade or British trade. And this is remarkable because the difference is huge. You know, I did an estimate only for the late 18th, early 19th century. Around the turn of the century, Dean and Cole's estimate gives you an English trade GDP ratio of 36%. That is trade as a proportion of English GDP, or rather England, Wales, and France and Scotland taken together. British GDP, really. But the correct trade GDP ratio was not 36%, this 58%. So it is not a minor mistake. You know, underlying this view that our trade is not important is an agenda. I cannot believe that all these very bright economic historians, just by accident, by mistake, made a wrong calculation of their own trade. So again, I would ask you as research students, whatever you read with an open mind. You read by giving every benefit of doubt to the person who's giving you wrong facts or wrong estimates. But in the end, you have to critique these estimates. Because unless you do so, the discipline cannot advance. We will be permanently stuck in a morass of incorrect interpretation of what happened in history. Now, if I have 2 or 3 minutes, I think I've talked a lot, then I would just
विकास जी आपका माइक ओपन है, बंद कर लीजिए।
माइक बंद करूं?
नहीं
नहीं
मैम,
आपको नहीं मैम, आप कंटिन्यू करें।
प्लीज कंटिन्यू मैम।
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to talk about is the analysis of famines. And here again, we are excessively influenced by the distorted interpretations that we get from the northern universities. Now, the colonizers in the late colonizers, like Germany and Belgium, used atrocities against the people they colonized. For example, King Leopold of Belgium became infamous because between the 1880s and up to the First War, Belgium was forcing in the Congo the local population to provide free labor for collecting natural rubber from the forests. They would keep the families of these local men hostage. And if any of the men protested about providing free labor, he would have his hand chopped off. And they would put up chopped hands, right hands actually, not the left hand, the right hand chopped up. They would put up a row of chopped hands in order to terrorize the other villagers and force them to contribute labor. Similarly, in Namibia, Germany set up camps where local tribes that resisted their domination were physically exterminated. And this was up to the First World War. And these camps were known as death camps, and they are very widely regarded as being the precursor of the death camps later on within 20 years in Nazi Germany, that was set up in Nazi Germany. But these things are very easy for anybody to understand. You know, atrocities are atrocities. You don't need a degree in economics or in history to understand how they dominated these and exploited these local populations and physically exterminated them. But the British were extremely clever. They did not go around chopping off people's hands or putting people in death camps. They also killed millions of people in famines in India. But they did so through fiscal and monetary policy, which is far more difficult to understand, right? And the only exception was the very first famine, which you will find is not discussed by anybody. Not even, and this first famine was in Bengal in 1769-70. It killed 1/3 of the then population of Bengal. The East India Company officials themselves said that 10 million people out of the 30 million population of Bengal had been physically exterminated in this famine. But do you find any reference, any discussion of this famine? Not in this book. Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay has a paper, The Famine and Mortality Regime Under Colonialism, in which he is specifically talking about Bengal and the famines in Bengal.
Yeah.
But the only famines he talks about are the 19th century famines, 3 or 4 of them. He does not talk about the biggest famine of them all, which took away 1/3 of the population of Bengal at the beginning of British rule. And he does not talk about the 1943-44 famine in Bengal, which killed 3 million people, the wartime famine, which was again a deliberate famine engineered by British imperialism, using the macroeconomic ideas of John Maynard Keynes to institute a deliberate profit inflation in Bengal. Now, why? Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay is a very progressive economic historian. He's talking specifically about famine and mortality regimes. So why does he ignore the biggest, and in Bengal, why does he ignore the biggest famine that ever happened in Bengal, which is the initial famine? And why did it take place? It took place because once the company officials got the right of revenue collection in 1765 from the Mughal emperor, they seem to have gone mad with avarice because they realized that they no longer had to
क्या हो गया?
advance a single penny of their own money to purchase the goods in which they were trading. They could simply collect money as a revenue from the local peasantry and use that. So their trade, the acquisition of goods would become completely free.
मेरे पास है ना ये.
And at that point of time, I do not think the East India Company thought of itself as a company which would rule Bengal for 100 years. They had the mentality of a trading company, not the mentality of a ruler. So they went hammer and tongs. They quadrupled the revenue demand on the Bengal peasantry. Now, the Nawab was already taking enough. The Nawab was not a philanthropic person who left a lot of produce with the peasants. He left them enough for them to survive and continue the cycle of reproduction. But he was taking quite enough. Imagine within 5 years, between 1765, 4 years actually, and 1769, the revenue collection is quadrupled. So they took away the seed corn. They took away the consumption reserves of the peasantry. What happens? By the 3rd and 4th year, people start dying. Why did they not resist? Because it is so unexpected. The peasantry have been paying revenue for decades and decades to the local ruler, whether it was a Hindu Raja or a Nawab deputed by the Mughal emperor, it made no difference, but they took revenue in moderation. But here was a company which knew no bounds to its avarice and to its cruelty. So what you had was probably the most massive famine that ever occurred in history, and that famine has been obliterated by the English economic historians from their history books. Not only are the English students never taught about this famine, so influenced and hegemonized are our own economic historians that even they do not write about this first famine. So this is something that you have to think about very seriously. And I think everyone has to approach the standard textbooks, whether they are written from abroad or whether they're written from Indian universities, with a very open and a very critical mind. And you have to go back to the original sources to find out what actually happened. Okay, so let me stop there now. And if I don't know what the format of the discussion is, if there are questions to the panelists or what, you can carry on. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. The question answer session will begin, ma'am, after the presidential address.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
थैंक यू मैम, आपने पुस्तक के विविध पक्षों को बारीकी से हमारे सामने विश्लेषित किया, हमारे सामने रखा। इस सारगर्भित व्याख्यान के लिए बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद मैम। मुझे लगता है पुस्तक के तीनों महत्वपूर्ण बिंदुओं पर, महत्वपूर्ण पक्षों का आर्थिक विश्लेषण हमारे सामने रखा गया है। और हमारे बीच पुस्तक के संपादक प्रोफेसर शिरीन मूसवी मैम जुड़ी हुई हैं, लगातार सुन रही हैं। तो मैं आज के अध्यक्षीय वक्तव्य के लिए मैम से आग्रह करूंगा कि मैम अध्यक्षीय वक्तव्य रखें। स्वागत है मैम।
मैम प्लीज अनम्यूट, मैम प्लीज अनम्यूट योर डिवाइस। Yes, yes,
I'm
ma'am.
most grateful uh, to the to for the to the Research Scholars Association, and particularly its
Thank you, ma'am.
chief chairperson, for holding a discussion on this book. And I'm grateful to all those who came here, particularly my own supervisor and teacher, Professor Irfan Habib, who took time out to be here and to give his opinion, and also Professor Prabhat Patnaik and Utsa Patnaik, both of them good friends and themselves, say, famous economists, unlike me, who is more of a historian, though I work on economic history, thanks to Professor Irfan Habibs, who was my research supervisor, because he made me study economics as well and always encouraged me to keep on writing. I certainly missed Aditya here, which I don't know why disappeared, a good friend. I was looking forward to meeting him here. So I'm grateful particularly to uh, to the president of the uh, Research Scholars Association, Mr. Vikas Kumar Saab, who organized this and considered my book worth being discussed. I hope the younger generation will be going much ahead of us and will be breaking new grounds, which we also tried in our time, but of course, as time passes, the entire uh, way of thinking and the entire amount available, the new problems we face in economy and in polity and others, make us think afresh and come face to face with new problems and with new happenings. So I hope the Research Scholars Association, as well as the particularly the association which has invited or the discussion on my book, as well as its members, will be doing well. I wish them all success in life, and I'm most grateful to them for organizing this program. Thank you very much.
एक्चुअली
थैंक यू
थैंक यू
मैम,
सो मच मैम।
बहुत शुक्रिया।
अगर इरफान सर की इजाजत हो तो आदित्य सर ने एक छोटा सा मैसेज भेजा है कि पैनलिस्ट के बीच में आप उसे रीड कर दीजिएगा। सो
जरूर पढ़ दीजिए। आदित्य
यस,
नहीं आए इसकी मुझे बहुत शिकायत है। आपको मृदुला को बुला लेते साथ तो दोनों आ जाते।
यस, नहीं नहीं मैम, उन्होंने उनका कुछ इश्यूज है। डियर पैनलिस्ट एंड गेस्ट, my apologies. I will not able to speak at the event as I developed a
राइट, ओके
complication in my after
ओके।
cataract surgery and after an eye angiography had be given an injection in the eye. Um, as a result, I am unable to read and therefore cannot speak on the book. I am sorry to inform you so late. I was hoping I will recover enough to participate. Unfortunately, that is not the case. I have noted
I I
your,
wish
yes,
you
yes, ma'am.
good health and be a quick recovery. Thank you very much.
Okay. Please, please, Ganesh Lal ji. थैंक यू सो मच। सो हमारे पास कई
थैंक यू
क्वेश्चंस।
विकास जी।
यस 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 प्लीज।
हाँ
If there are any questions, I will be
Yes,
more
yes,
than
ma'am.
happy to
We,
answer.
but several participants have sent their question, but हम लोग 2 या 3 क्वेश्चन ही लेंगे केवल। गणेश लाल जी
हाँ,
प्लीज।
मैं
As
प्रतिभागियों
many
से
as you
आपसे
like,
May
सहमत
I'm
I
हूँ।
at
ask
your
question, sir?
disposal.
Yeah, yes,
May
yes,
I
but
ask question?
yes,
जी जी
yes,
First
yes.
of all, I would like to thank Madam Shireen Moosvi and then Irfan Habib, sir. I am from South India. I am from Tamil Nadu. I am attending the refresher course in that Uttarakhand, that Komian University. Through that only I know this platform. First of all, I would like to clarify some doubt with that. I don't know that Prabhat, madam, I think so, whether I don't know pronouncing correct or not. But here, uh, ma'am said about that the young research scholar must not must see the things in a research manner, and then and about university other that foreign scholars, they their view is very different from our views, that means Indian views. So here in my yesterday class, one madam was shared about her thought about that William Pending was not abolished the sati. In that way, all the time they are only criticizing the British administration and then colonialism. But we must understand, we must acknowledge their reforms as well as their exploitation. Okay, isn't it, madam? In the young research scholars, they must know both the part. Am I correct, ma'am?
Yes, I fully agree that we must look at both the side of the coins, but at the
Yes,
same
ma'am.
time, we have to keep in mind that the British came here for exploitation.
Yes,
We
ma'am.
and what they did was to destroy a large amount of our economic, or say that, position. And we know what has happened because I happen to have read that period of history as well, because in AMU the courses are available. So I have studied modern world, and I realized that it was not only India, but the British were ready to colonize and to have a drain of wealth. How much we suffered out of that drain of wealth. So no one can ever think that a colonial period can be of can be rather tolerated, or colonialism can be tolerated. We should not try to have control over other countries, and we should not let others be able to colonize ours, or to exploit our people and our resources for their goods. How much was the drain
Yes,
of wealth? We have studied so much. I have written something about it. I have heard, learned it from my supervisor, Professor Irfan Habib's own work. So the drain of wealth and other things has to be kept in mind. And colonialism cannot be certainly tolerated.
I would like to
Yes, yes, ma'am.
add
Please,
a
please,
couple of
Utsa, ma'am.
words,
Please.
if I may.
Yes, ma'am. Please,
Um,
please.
Yes,
you
Utsa.
see, the questioner said something about their reforms should be acknowledged, the good things they should do should be acknowledged.
I
You
I have
see,
yet to find out the real good things. If there are any says which look like that, set
yes,
that
I'm trying
sati
to.
system and this and that, so that may be there. But one has to see those who have come to plunder us, to have a drain of wealth. That really brought us to a very bad state. That has to be kept in mind as well.
No, I
Uh,
wanted to add
Otherwise,
a few
that's
words.
all right that we might have learned a lot from anyone, even our enemies, we learn. So I agree with that as far as
No, no,
Utsa's
I'm not
viewpoint.
supporting the
Actually,
questioner's
ma'am,
view at
Professor
all.
Utsa, ma'am, want to address something. Yes, ma'am.
I
Please,
wanted to
please. Yes.
respond to the questioner's point about
Mhm.
they're doing good things and reforms. You see, one of the most important ways, and I said the British were the cleverest amongst the colonizers, one of the most important ways that they control us is through this myth that they did good things. And
Yes,
they did good things, yes, but for a very small fraction of the
yes,
population to which you
yes,
and I belong. That
yes,
is a handful, few thousand English people did not rule over 200 million Indians around the year 1900 single handedly. They had the support of what the Latin Americans call the comprador classes. They were
yes,
very careful. They were very careful to look after the interests of the property owners in India. They,
yes,
in fact, put in place a set of laws which strengthened the hands of the zamindars, the moneylenders, the financiers, and that is the class from which, by and large, people like you and I are descended. We are not the sufferers. We are not, we were, our grandparents were not the sufferers from colonialism. Our great grandparents were not sufferers from colonialism. The people who suffered then are the people who are suffering today. That is the 80% of the population which comprises the laboring poor. That is the workers, the artisans, the farmers. They were the people who were exploited. And the property owners were colluded in this, were made to collude in this exploitation of their own countrymen. Let us be very clear on that.
yes.
Okay?
That might have happening, but as far as I know from my own family history, it was the British which took away the entire land, the whole group of villages which my uh, forefathers had. They came from Iran. They settled here ages ago, 5, 6 generations ago, but they were given by the Maharaja of Banaras a whole village to them because they were teaching his sons the Persian and other languages. And I know how, I was told how the British has taken away that, and how first the way before taking away, they were exploiting the peasants, making peasants almost go hungry and taking away all whatever they could. If they couldn't give it, they asked to give the money in cash, and therefore the peasants have to sell it at very cheap prices. And afterwards have to live on the leaves rather than living on the grain. So I may rather respectfully disagree with you that we cannot just think that the colonialization in any way was good or tolerable. All right, we learned English, we got some new ideas, but if it would not have been through the colonizers, but really some people coming and um, spreading these sort of things. There might be a few people who might have come with that idea to educate Indians or to make, but if the British did it, they did it because by that they could exploit it, exploiters better. The skill is for skilled laborers to produce more and to give
Okay, ma'am.
them.
Thank you, ma'am. I agree. I agree with you. Then one thing you said before during.
Bijol ma'am, please, we have other participants. So after this, हम आपका क्वेश्चन लेंगे. सो कुछ और लोगों का हम यदि क्वेश्चन
और
कुछ ले लें.
हमारे
जी जी
किसी
जी जी,
साथी का
प्लीज
कुछ
रिफा
सवाल
रिफा
है तो
प्लीज.
आप पूछ सकते हैं।
यस यस रिफा. Rifa, please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. First introduce yourself, then you ask the question. Yeah.
A very good evening to all the high dignitaries here. My name is Rifa Tabassum. I'm a research scholar in the Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University. I am heartily thankful to all the dignitaries who have taken time and efforts to invest for sharing their knowledge with all of us here on this platform of IRSA. I'm thankful to Prabhat ma'am, sir, Irfan Habib sir, Shireen Musbi ma'am, and congratulate Shireen Musbi ma'am for the incredible work that she has done. Uh, my question is from you, intellectuals, is that as I'm a research scholar and doing research on gender neutrality and sensitization, my question is that uh, what are the challenges and opportunities do you think really exist in order for women political participation in this era of global governance? As we are on the topic of globalization, capitalism, so sir, kindly edify what you people have a stand on women political participation in this era of global governance.
Please, Irfan sahab, please.
Yes, Irfan, sir, please.
Uh, well, actually, this is a very hard question for me because I deal with things in the past, and this question relates to the future. Um,
Yes,
Obviously, mankind is in a direction of providing more rights and more, quite correctly, more power to women who constitute, of course, half the population.
yes,
And so um I think it's a very big achievement of modern civilization to at least set forth the principle of equality between men and women. In our old civilizations, the reverse was the case. The women were looked down upon. In religious texts, they were denounced. Both Hindus and Muslims are equally guilty of this, and also Buddhists. But with modern civilization, a turn has come. So clearly, the future lies in equality. And if today women authors are few, I'm sure, relatively, in subjects like history and economics, I think in future they would rise to 50%. And when that comes about, that would be a great achievement of mankind. Thank you.
thank you, sir. Thank
Actually,
you so
Professor
much.
Prabhat Patnaik want to say something. Yes, sir, please.
Yes, sir, please.
Prabhat sir, please unmute your device.
Yeah. Yes. I have absolutely no doubt that we are moving towards a future in which women and men would play equal roles in public life, in political life, and so on. I have absolutely no doubt at all about that. And as Irfan Saab said, that is the trend of modern civilization, and it will be eventually carried forward. But I'm worried about what's happening at the moment. What is happening at the moment is a kind of counter revolution in country after country. I mean, you look at what happened in Syria the other day. You look at Afghanistan. All over the world, there is in fact a tendency. I talked about the tendency towards neo-fascism, but there's a tendency for the dominant capitalist powers to make common cause with fundamentalists of various kinds, and these fundamentalists are all against giving equal rights to women. So, in the immediate short run, I think we are really going to have great difficulty in ensuring equal rights. But on the other hand, as far as the longer run is concerned, I have absolutely no doubts.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir.
Yes, sir.
So we are moving
Thank you
to,
so
yeah,
much.
yeah, Rifa, you have any question? So after the one question you can ask. So now we are moving to the next question. Ashwini Kumar, please.
Very good evening to everyone, and especially our panelist and the editor of book, ma'am. First of all, congratulations. My name is Ashwini Kumar. I'm also a research scholar in Department of Economics, IGNTU. There's a no question, but it's just a clarification with the Usha ma'am that she discussed about the definition of export or import. Let's see. Also try to add on that there is some kind of free goods export or import is happening in around us. I mean, with the countries. Like when we see all the things with economic perspective, I don't think what is the free goods. And so please put, madam, please put some view on this. Like how free goods export or import is happening.
Sorry. 1 minute. I think there is some
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes,
some,
sir. Yeah.
some problem with her. Just 1 minute.
And it was, ma'am, a wonderful speech that I'm engaged with you, especially Irfan sir and
Yeah.
Patnaik sir.
Yes, Prabhat Sahib is answering the question.
No, Utsa ma'am is answering. Yeah.
Utsa ma'am, right.
Yes, sir.
Before that, I want to congratulate Shireen ma'am for wonderful book that you have made. I mean, you all have made for us. I'm definitely going to get it and read it because I have to read to know more about the history of economics and globalization capitalism. Thank you so much, ma'am.
It's an edited work which has papers from all others. My work was only to collect them together and to put them under the advice of my supervisor, Professor Irfan Habib, who has also uh, contributed to. कहाँ गायब हो गई इनको जगह?
या ज्वाइन कर लिया, उन्होंने रिज्वाइन कर लिया मैम. यस, फिर से किया.
समझ में नहीं आ रहा है कब तक चलाएंगे. शिरीन बीबी को बोलना है, वो बोल नहीं रही.
No, I don't think the question is to me. Now it is to someone else. Otherwise, I would have come out.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, I'm
Irfan
sorry,
sir,
there
this
was
is the
some.
last question. After this, we will end the session. Yes, ma'am. Please, Utsa ma'am.
I think there was a bit of a problem. I went offline for some reason. But can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
You can hear me?
जी जी
I think the question was about re-export, right? I missed half the question because I went offline. Huh?
Free exports. You said free. They got goods free.
Oh, I see. The question was about how the British got the goods free from us, I think, right? Was that the question?
Ma'am, actually, you discussed about the import and some definition of import and
Ah,
export.
yes. No, he's talking about re-export.
And
Not
you discussed
re-export.
the free
Yeah,
goods
yeah.
that import and export is happening, and like import, like they are importing free goods and again value added things happening and they again exporting. Like how when we in present world and
No.
economic तरीके से हम लोग
There are two different issues. One is the fact that once they got control, political control over the country, once we became a colony of conquest, as opposed to a colony of settlement, like Canada or South Africa. These are colonies of settlement where the English went and settled, but we were a colony of conquest. So once they got the political control, they did not have to pay anything for what they took from us. And they had an enormous demand, not only in their own country, but throughout Northern Europe and North America for our goods and the goods from all tropical countries, because they are not capable of producing these goods. The output of these goods is zero in their countries, but these goods are an essential part of their consumption basket. Without consuming these goods, the living standard of northern populations would go back to medieval levels. So imports for them became free. That was one of the major reasons for conquest.
आजकल जरा फोन उठाना
And it just keep speaking.
यार नहीं मेरे मुझे नहीं अरे चिल्लाओ नहीं
Okay, okay, thank you.
The second issue
Yes.
is the definition of trade that you asked about. The correct definition of a country's trade is exports, total exports plus total imports. In total exports, you include export of the goods you produce in your country plus re-exports, RE, re-exports of any goods that you have imported from other countries. Okay. And in total imports, you include not only the imported goods you use within your country, but that part of total imports which you do not use within your country, but send to other countries. Okay? So what I was saying is that if you look at Netherlands, France, Britain, all of these had huge colonial empires from which they got free goods using the local taxes they collected. They didn't have to pay for these goods. So they could run trade deficits with impunity. They did not have to pay for their trade deficits because the producers had been paid already out of their own taxes. The producers were not actually being paid. They were being defrauded of their goods, but they did not know it. They did not know they were being defrauded because they got money and they did not know that the money came out of their own tax payment. So it was a very clever system. Okay. Now, all these countries had a very large re-export trade because the amount they imported from the Caribbean, from India, from other Asian colonies was too large for their own economy's requirement. So they had a surplus of goods, free goods, they didn't have to pay for it, which they could then export to other temperate land countries. For example, Britain could re-export Indian tropical commodities to North America in exchange for North American cotton imports of raw cotton from North America, or food grains from North America. It could re-export Indian free goods that it got as the equivalent of taxes to Scandinavian countries in return for iron from Sweden, timber for its shipbuilding industry. Even those goods it got free because it was getting them in exchange for Indian goods which it had got free. Okay, so this entire trade network is something, this definition, correct definition of trade, is something which is not followed by a single historian. I'm saying this very seriously, and I've critiqued them in various articles. They all give you the wrong definition of trade when they calculate their own trade, because they leave out the re-exports completely. So as a result, the figures they give you for their trade and for the trade GDP ratio is all wrong. They're underestimates. All right. And no English economic historian has ever contradicted me on this. I asked my good friend who was with me in Cambridge many years ago, Barbara. What's her second name? Yeah, Barbara Harris. Barbara Harris. And she said, yes, they've all read you, and yeah, they accept the argument. So I have not had anybody contradicting me when I say that you are giving wrong estimates of trade, you have underestimated British trade. But imagine a country whose universities we look up to, actually not a single economic historian has calculated the trade of their own country correctly. Okay? So this is why I say that when you read anything, you have to read it critically and simply do not accept anything that is said without looking at the logical basis of what is being said.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am. And sorry, participants.
Thank you, ma'am.
We are not taking more questions. I would like to invite Sakshi Singh for the formal vote of thanks. Yes, Sakshi, please.
Yes, sir. I'll participate and to speak. As Sakshi educator of education capacity, as book discussion,
शायद आवाज नहीं आ रही उनकी